there will be links that will be shared across. So the links will be shared via the chat box. You have to click on them and be able to interact. So to start us off then, just to give us some highlights of this session where we are today. This session is one of the sessions whereby the World Bank team is disseminating part of this report. And of course, there are sections we're going to see that are very relevant to Kenya and the Kenyan context, at least as of now. Thank you so much, Milena, for sharing the screen for people to be able to be aware of where we are. So to give some insights here then is that the Women, Business and the Law report, which we welcome you to check on the link and you'll be able really to find the entire report. Our session today is largely on reforming laws for women's economic empowerment in Kenya. And essentially is that this report identifies the barriers to women's economic empowerment and also economic participation, and also encourages what we call reform of discriminatory laws that are in existence today. Also, we're going to get a presentation of the relationships that exist between legal, gender equality and women's employment and entrepreneurship. And as we look at this, there is a good subject also therein that is currently ripe in Kenya, that of childcare. So this report also captures the provisions of childcare and the implementation within the law. And so we welcome you to really participate and also listen to the team as they share with us insights about the legal barriers that women are facing, the evidence on how this affects the economic opportunities, and also looking at the best practices. What works is what we are all looking for at such a time as this. So some of the key areas that we'll be listening to are issues of unpaid care, issues of women's employment, and also entrepreneurship. The main objective being that this session is meant to increase our awareness, also collaboration, to enhance collaboration, learning around the evidence related to women's economic empowerment work in Kenya. This session is going to last for the next 120 minutes, of which case we're going to have 45 minutes of presentations, then 15 minutes of questions and answer. And then there will be very interesting two groups, thematic working groups, whereby we will be, we break out into two groups. One group will be more about, we're discussing more on availability, towards available, affordable and quality childcare services. Another one will be speaking more about the key ingredients to women's legal rights in Kenya. The teams that are going to help us to discuss this further are already here with us. And of course, we have Emilia Jailano. She will be able to come up on screen. You'll see her in a short while. She's a development specialist with the World Bank. And she is part of this team since the beginning, and she's been supporting research on the measures and looking into the effectiveness of the implementation of the laws and the regulations. We shall also have our own Catherine Gidai, who's the program manager, Men Engaged Kenya Network. And she's also been part of this, and she's authored one of the reports that is going to be shared today, especially on the ingredients, and looking forward to listen to what she has to say and the findings that they established. The same session shall also be led by Frederick Kinyaga, who's the national founder and chairperson, Men Engaged Kenya Network. And Frederick has a wide experience of over 20 years engaging in male engagement, and of course, issues of HIV, adolescent sexual reproductive health, having worked in diverse cultural backgrounds. He will be able to share more in the sessions ahead of us. We also have Alina, who's also another private sector development specialist with the World Bank, and her current research focuses on the regulatory and the policy gaps around availability, affordability, and the quality of childcare services. And all this work is about issues of data, issues of coming up with the right measurement indicators and development of strategies. We're going to hear more from her And lastly, we shall have Isabel Sant'Agostino, who's also another private sector development specialist with the World Bank Group. And also she leads the research on violence against women and the indicators on domestic violence and sexual harassment. And these are all subjects that are key to us today, even as we listen through. So without taking much time, I would want us to really start off now. And I want to welcome Isabel and Emilia to share the presentation that they have. Thank you so much.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for this kind invitation and for joining us today. It's truly an honor to be here with you this afternoon or this morning to discuss about the work we're doing at the World Bank's Women, Business and the Law project. And in particular, we would like to thank ICRW Africa and the Women Economic Empowerment Community of Practice for organizing this event, but also to CGDev for bringing us together today. So I'd like to start with a question. How many women around the world do you think do not have access to equal economic opportunities? And the answer may shock you. It's more than 2 billion women, which means that the economic potential of the world is untapped when half of its population is not able to participate fully. Further, as we see now, the world is experiencing incredible difficulties. We have wars, displacement, climate change, and a global pandemic. And as we saw, crises are never gender neutral, as women have been disproportionately affected by all of them. And one of the reasons why women are more negatively affected by all these events is that because they start at a disadvantage. All over the world, we see that our discriminatory laws that force women onto an uneven playing field, threatening not only their economic security, but also the one of their communities and countries. And therefore, gender equality is essential, not only for peace and security, but also to achieve key development goals and boost economic growth. So during this presentation with my colleague Emilia, we'll provide a brief overview of our project, followed by our global findings, specific data for Kenya, and also an overview of our new areas of research. So at the World Bank Group, we believe that no economy can achieve its true potential without the equal involvement of both women and men. And during over more than a decade, the World Bank's Women, Business and the Law project has identified where exactly laws limit women's full economic empowerment and participation as employees or entrepreneurs. So our data explores laws across these 8 indicators, which are structured around the interaction that women have with the law as they progress through their lives and careers in 190 countries. The indicators, as you can see, are mobility, workplace, pay, marriage, parenthood, entrepreneurship, assets, and pension. And basically, our index identifies where discriminatory laws persist in these 8 areas, affecting different stages of women's professional lives, and highlights opportunities for reform. But why is legal gender equality important? So Women, Business and the Law's research builds evidence of the critical link between gender equality and economic growth. Gender equality is associated with narrowing the gender gap in development outcomes, in particular with higher female labor force participation, lower vulnerable employment, more women owning businesses, and greater representation of women in national parliaments. So inequalities like the ones we continue seeing in the law contribute to earning gaps between men and women. And a very interesting recent World Bank study found that closing this gap could add up to $172 trillion to the world's economy, which is equivalent to 2 times the annual global GDP. So let's now see what is the current state of legal gender equality. So let's take a look at the main findings of this year's report. So our report this year highlighted that, number 1, although we have learned a lot about the benefits of gender equality over the last several decades, and since 1970, over 1,500 legal reforms have been enacted by all economies around the world to close the legal gender gap, Women, Business and the Law has found that women have only 3/4 of the legal rights afforded to men, as the global average is still 76.5. We also see that only 12 economies obtain a maximum score of 100, meaning that only in those 12 countries, men and women are on equal legal standing across the areas measured by the index. This also means that there are still 178 countries which have remaining gaps between men and women, which impact, of course, over 2 billion women. Number 3, we also see that gradually we are making progress, and also despite the pandemic, we see that 23 economies across all regions have implemented reforms in the indicators covered by our index in 2021. And many of the new laws are in areas that need it the most, providing, for example, more benefits to working parents and improving conditions for women in the workplace. And then what we also saw is that geographically, most reforms were passed in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, which are the regions furthest behind, but where also there has been a steady reform momentum over the past few years. And very interestingly, we saw that the country that reformed the most was Gabon. Gabon reformed its civil code and introduced domestic violence legislation for the first time. And as a result of this comprehensive set of reforms, its score rose from 57.5 to 82.5. So as you can see, there's still a lot of work left to be done to advance the gender equality agenda. And while progress has been made, the pace of reforms must really be accelerated. As you can see here, there's great variation of laws, both across and within regions. Every region has examples of economies whose governments have enacted good practice laws and those that still have room to improve. And for instance, countries can look to their neighbors for examples when seeking to reform or inspire others to do so. So now let's take a look at the data for Kenya. So we see that the regional average is for Sub-Saharan Africa, 71.5, which is lower than the global average of 76.5. And also lower than Kenya's score of 80.6. So again, we see that the average score for Sub-Saharan African countries is 71.5, which is also lower than the OECD high-income economies average of 95.2. We also see that Kenya scores 100 in 4 of the 8 indicators, showing room for improvement in the areas of parenthood, entrepreneurship, assets, and pension. And we will take a look at each area in detail shortly. Another interesting thing that we've been working on is that in WBL in 2019, WBL began the exercise of looking back 50 years and track the progress of reforms in all 190 countries covered by our index. And the goal of this research was to understand in which ways the presence or absence of laws and regulations that enhance women's rights is connected to certain outcomes, such as women's labor force participation, presence of women in parliaments, among others. And here you can see the progress of 50 years of reforms in Kenya in the areas specifically covered by the Women, Business and the Law Index. And in particular, we can see that most reforms took place from the end of the 2000s. And later, during one of our thematic discussions, we will go in depth into the details of some of Kenya's most recent labor and violence against women reforms to see what motivated them and what was the process that led to the enactment of legislation in those areas. Now, before proceeding with my colleague Emilia's analysis by indicator, I would like to highlight that in order for us to make this study possible, we rely on a case study which has some assumptions. So in particular, we assume that the woman resides in the main business city of the economy, which in this case is Nairobi. So we only consider the laws that apply there. And also we assume that the woman has reached the legal age of majority and is in a monogamous first marriage registered with the appropriate authorities. And now over to you, Emilia.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you very much to the Women Economic Empowerment Community of Practice for having us present. So let me dive into the first indicator, mobility. This indicator measures restrictions to women's freedom of movement. In particular, we look at a woman's capacity to leave the home, travel, obtain a passport, and choose where to live in the same way as a man. Kenya obtains the maximum score in this area. However, there are still gaps globally. For example, in 34 countries, women cannot choose where to live in the same way as a man. Laws and provisions that regulate the ability of women to take decisions independently when it comes to freedom of movement, including the freedom to choose where to live, are important because they are related with greater entrepreneurial capacity of women, more likelihood to have a bank account, and of owning movable and immovable property. The workplace indicator examines protections against discrimination and sexual harassment in the workplace, as well as the ability for women to freely choose their employment. Kenya obtains a perfect score on this indicator again. But why is having these laws so important? A World Bank study found that there are non-discrimination clauses in place, more women work. And sexual harassment in the workplace is not only unacceptable behavior, it is also it has also economic consequences for women, businesses, and countries, as it is associated with greater turnover and absenteeism from work, decreased profitability of companies, and ultimately a decline in women's participation in the labor market. Let's now take a look at the pay indicator. Just 15 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including Kenya, and a little more than 1/3 globally receive a score of 100 on the pay indicator. Jobs restrictions and the gender wage gap are critical topics covered by our index. This area is important because studies show that where there are job restrictions, less women work. Women are segregated only to certain sectors, and there is a wider gender wage gap. 95 countries worldwide still have not adopted legislation guaranteeing equal remuneration for work of equal value, as established in the ILO, International Labour Organization, Equal Pay Convention number 100. Now let's move over to the marriage indicator, which analyzes laws that can affect women during or after marriage and in the eventuality of a divorce. Kenya is one of the 14 countries in sub-Saharan Africa to score 100, a perfect score on the marriage indicator. Why is this area important? Because empirical studies confirm that different rights in marriage can affect women's ability to negotiate within the home, increase the prevalence of domestic violence, which has an impact on their ability to work, and impact the financial security of women in the event of divorce. After marriage, many women decide to start a family. The parenthood indicator analyzes laws that affect women's work after pregnancy. In this area, Kenya obtains a score of 40. Kenya is among a minority of countries in the region that do not grant at least 98 days or 14 weeks of paid maternity leave. This is a standard established by the International Labour Organization in their Convention on the Protection of Maternity. The cost of maternity leave falls fully on the employer in Kenya, and there are no provisions establishing parental leave to help redistribute care work. This area is important because studies show that more women are employed and likely to return to work if the law mandates maternity leave and paternity leave, and if the government bears the cost of it rather than the employer. Maternity, paternity, and parental leave schemes can help recognize and redistribute unpaid care work, and it is preferable that the government bears the cost because it can be expensive for the employer to cover it, which may translate into a disincentive to employ women. The ILO's Maternity Protection Convention establishes, as I mentioned, a minimum of 98 days or 14 weeks of paid maternity leave. And these are two good practice examples from the Republic of Congo and South Africa, which mandate 105 and 120 days of paid maternity leave, respectively. And this maternity leave is paid for by the government. Another indicator that we publish data on is the entrepreneurship indicator. This indicator measures constraints on women's ability to start and run their own businesses. It is important to highlight that women face different hurdles when running a business compared to men. In this area, Kenya obtains a score of 50 because it is among the 104 countries globally that do not prohibit gender-based discrimination in access to credit. Kenya is also one of just 4 economies in sub-Saharan Africa and 7 worldwide that does not allow women to register a business in the same way as a man. Article 6 of the Registration of Business Names Act requires a married woman who wants to register a business to include the name and surname of her husband, while a married man is not required to provide such information about his wife. These disparities, even though they may sound small, can limit women's ability to make effective choices and transform these choices into economic outcomes. Equal access to credit is essential for women to open their businesses and thrive as entrepreneurs. The lack of a provision that prohibits gender-based discrimination in financial services leaves women's access to credit up to the discretion of financial institutions that may impose different and burdensome criteria to grant women loans and funds to keep their business afloat. In order to function, the institutional environment must take into account the limitations that women face in accessing credit, as well as the effects of discrimination. Interestingly, our analysis shows that where the law prohibits discrimination in access to credit based on gender, more women have an account at a financial institution and a debit card in their own name. Access to property is fundamental to increase women's financial security and to grant them the necessary guarantees to start a business. The assets indicator measures differences in property and in inheritance rights and whether the law recognizes the value of non-monetary contributions during marriage, such as unpaid care for children and the household work. In this area, Kenya obtains a score of 80, because male and female surviving spouses don't have equal rights to inherit assets as established in Article 36 of the Law of Succession Act. Why is access to property so important, and in particular, equal inheritance rights? For many women, strong property rights can allow them to leverage assets for economic gain. Access to property can both increase women's financial security and provide them with the necessary collateral to start businesses. Our last indicator is the pension indicator, which assesses laws affecting women's economic prospects in retirement. In this area, Kenya obtains a score of 75 because periods of absence from work due to childcare are not accounted for in pension benefits. Explicit recognition of maternity leave as qualifying period of employment allows women's retirement savings to continue growing while on care leave. Why is it important to take these periods of absence into account? Women face more barriers than men at the time of entering the labor market. They earn less than men, will more often take leave from work to care for children or relatives. And if during these times they don't accumulate benefits, their pensions end up being smaller than men's. And if we also consider that women live longer lives than men, on average, the conclusion is that they are more likely to be poor in old age. Here we can see 2 good practice examples from Côte d'Ivoire and Zimbabwe. In Côte d'Ivoire, for example, periods of interrupted work during which the employed woman receives maternity allowance are accounted for when calculating the amount of retirement pension, regardless of contribution. It is important to continue exploring the critical relationship between women's rights and economic outcomes and further build the case for gender equality in all areas of life. For this reason, this year, our team is expanding its research to 2 new areas: the provision of childcare services and the implementation of the law. Taking care of children should not be treated as a woman's issue, as it is essential for building inclusive societies. Our pilot data on childcare in 95 countries measures the legal frameworks with regards to 3 pillars: the availability, affordability, and quality of childcare services. What we found is that there is a lack of adequate policies governing the provisions of affordable and quality childcare around the world. Clearly, this area needs to become a priority going forward to achieve better outcomes for women, children, and the economy as a whole. And you can hear more if you join the breakout session led by our colleague Alina, who will share more information about this and about the situation in Kenya. Implementation and enforcement are critical barriers to gender equality. Gaps between laws on the books and the actual practice restrict the full realization of women's rights and opportunities all over the world. To present a fuller picture of the legal environment for women, we developed a new conceptual framework to measure the implementation of the laws and regulations benchmarked by our index. A pilot exercise of 25 countries reveals gaps between the laws on the books and actual practice, confirming that laws alone are not enough to ensure gender equality. In our team, we are now working to explore further these gaps, and we hope to deliver a fully developed framework in the future. If the last few years have taught us anything, it is that we cannot wait to make gender equality a priority. The need for reform is even more urgent today because the COVID-19 pandemic and other challenges have widened the gender inequalities around the world. Data reveals a larger drop in the proportion of female full-time employees relative to male. That gender pay gap has also widened. Women are more likely than men to take leave from work and to resign their positions to care for children and experience domestic violence. One positive aspect is that recent data shows that some women-owned firms adapted to digital platforms faster than men. Access to digital technologies such as mobile phones, computers, and the internet are critical to enable women to start new businesses, discover new markets, and find better jobs. To conclude, achieving gender equality requires a concerted effort by governments, civil society, international organizations, and the private sector, among others. But legal and regulatory reforms can serve as an important first step to improve the lives of women, their families, and communities. Women Business and the Law is continuing to assist in this effort by, of course, celebrating the progress made, but also by emphasizing opportunities for positive change and reform. I invite you to join one of our breakout sessions later and to visit our website by scanning the QR code displayed on the presentation. On our website, you will find our 50 years of data, country-specific results, our reports, case studies, economy snapshots, and blogs, among others. With this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and for organizing this session, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Isabel and Emilio, for that presentation. I've just pasted a link on the chat box. Kindly open the link. In there are a number of questions that we will be attending to, even as we give our reactions to this session that has just ended. And allow me to recognize some of the team members that are here. Dr. Joyce Mwikali, that is the chair for the National Gender and Equality Commission. Welcome, Dr. Professor Judith Waudo, who's the head of the Kenyatta University WeHub. Welcome, Prof. We have many other institutions, Plan International, World Bank team, the SDG Forum, Soroptimist International, Data2X, Busara Center, FSD, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, and many, many more. So kindly feel welcome and let's continue to engage. Please open the link and maybe Emiliano, you can take off your screen and share mine so that I can direct us on how we are answering that question over there. So the link that I've just shared, this is what you'll do. You just open it. If it's as opened on your end, you'll see the page that is on my screen right now. This page is, oh, sorry. I don't know whether I've, sorry for that. Sorry for the mix up. I've stopped sharing so that I'm able to share again. so that we will be aligned, especially on what we want to do. Okay, I'm sharing my screen one more time. There it is. So you will be able to see this screen or as you open up. And the first question there is overview of the women in business, and of course the presentation that has just been made. Now, when you click to the next slide, we have a few questions there. If you go to the next slide up here where there is 2, you will see the first one. What surprised you about the presentation? So what you do on the left side, if you can see my my cursor, that is where there's an option of a sticky note. Just click on the sticky note, it will come on your screen. Then you'll be able to type in what stood out for you, and of course, save it. We will be able to see it here on the screen as it comes. It's anonymous. So just all of us are encouraged that we participate as much as we can. In just a few minutes, then we shall collect all the feedback that you are sharing with us. What surprised you about the presentation? If there is anything, kindly use that option. Click the stick note and type in, and we will be able to see your feedback. Thereafter, as you continue to click on that, I see there's someone already who's about to share. Are you able to, have you managed to open the link? If I can ask any one of you who has a challenge with it? If not, please go ahead and share with us what has surprised you about the presentation. Then as over there, you will click to the next, and in the next slide, you will find another question. What are the main issues with the implementation of the rights according to this report, the way they've just been mentioned? What would you say about the main issues? Then, of course, we will have the next one, which is how do you envision using the women business and the law data in your research and advocacy work? You also follow the same procedure, and we will be able to see the sticky notes here. And the last question, that will be our last question with that session. So kindly, let's interact. I'm not seeing, okay, at least I can see someone there has mentioned something on pension. How much, there's a question that how pension is calculated. That excludes the time a woman was on maternity leave. Not sure this is accurate. So I think, Emilio, you can look into that. It also sounds like a question. That nearly 2.4 billion women of a number of women age live in countries where they do not enjoy the same economic rights. This has surprised this participant. Someone else here is talking about the fact that there are countries where governments pay for paternal leave, even for private sector employees. I think that has also surprised a participant here, and I think it looks like a good practice. Anymore, we have many of us here, over 45, if we can all join in and be interactive as we can. Maybe in a second also, if we can do that, all of us, it will be helpful. Thank you so much for those that have already given us your responses. Anyone else? Good. There's someone there on the question number 2. What are the main issues with the implementation? Someone has already posted there about the implementation is largely headed by men who are likely to be blind to the biases against women. Thank you so much for the comment. We will be able to analyze all those comments. I hope it's easier for all of us to use the sticky notes. They are on your left sidebar of your screen. Thank you so much. For another one has just come in. Something that has also a main issue there is the political goodwill and financial muscle to deal with the obstacles on access to childcare and implementation of the law is another comment that is coming out as one of the main issues. Political goodwill, financial muscle, those are among the issues. Someone else, please. Let's continue to engage. so that we can, again, I remember the link was shared, the main report, just in case someone wants to check it out. The last question there is, how do you envision using the data in your research and advocacy work? You can also go to that slide. If you're able to see it on your side, please go ahead and tell us how you envision using the data. Once again, this is very anonymous. No one will know that it's you who has responded. So be free and feel free to interact kindly. Let me see whether there's more. Yes, there's someone else here saying perhaps gender norms and cultural inclinations affect implementation of the laws, and our society is largely patriarchal. A great comment right there. There's another comment, perhaps also making sure policymakers understand the real consequences of not implementing these rights. I think that Emiliano and Isabella, you can speak to that. The misunderstanding or not completely understanding the consequences of not implementing, if we can look at it that way as well. Back here, yep, there is someone who got surprised with paternal leave being paid in other countries. Let's see whether there are new comments here. There is another comment on how to, someone envisions to use this in research and advocacy, that is issue a guidance or advisory to the National Treasury and the Retirement Benefit Authority on the need to review the Kenyan pension law. And of course, looking at the Argentina explicitly accounted for periods of absence due to child, I think that's child care right there. It's a good comment. Another comment is there on gender aware regarding these laws and find workarounds, these biases, work to fix these biases and drive greater gender equality. This is how one envisions to use the data. Any other comment on the behind here? We are many of us, if we can be able to share our thoughts. So I think up to that point, Emiliano and Isabel, any comments so far on what you've seen the participants indicate here?
Yeah, I think it is somewhat surprising, but not that surprising to see the comments about governments paying for maternity and paternity leave in other countries. This is a best practice, exactly because if this cost is completely falling on the employer, employers may be reluctant to hire women because they foresee having to pay for potentially maternity or paternity leave. Of course, maternity leave is the greater cost of the two. This is why the International Labour Organization recommends for this leave to be paid with public funds administered by the government. There are schemes where the employer pays first and then is reimbursed, and there are also schemes where this cost is shared. So there are many variations, but usually the worst case scenario is for the full cost to be borne by the employer. On how pension is calculated, our data shows that there is no explicit provision in Kenya's National Social Security Fund Act about maternity leave being considered in an insured period for the purposes of the calculation of the pension benefits. But sometimes we make mistakes. So if indeed there is such a provision, or if there is such a provision somewhere else in the Kenyan legal framework, please do let us know, and we'll be happy to consider that. Though I did see in the slide Number 3, how do you envision using the WBL data? A suggestion to issue a guidance or advisory to the National Treasury to review Kenya's pension law to include such a provision. So that's already a very good indication. And indeed, your point, Crispin, about making sure that policymakers understand the real consequences of not implementing these rights. This is a key point, and I think this is also where the Women Economic Empowerment COP can do a lot by showing with evidence and data that not implementing these laws and regulations has a direct impact on economic opportunities for women. And there are a lot of gaps in implementation. As I mentioned, we see that even when laws are on the books, women are not able to enjoy the rights and protections afforded to them by law.
Okay. Thank you. Also in the chat box, there are a few other comments and how it impacts on women's economic empowerment. If there is some reaction to that, I think it will be much appreciated. There's also another comment that Professor Waudo is saying that I hope to use the findings to support current day what's happening at the moment, and especially I want to believe in Kenya. There's so much discussion around unpaid care and women's economic empowerment. Another comment is that the report is important for advocacy with all key stakeholders, including government, the private sector, the CSOs, and women rights organizations. And of course, it has a strong women's movement to drive advocacy messages and bring their voice for reforms and of course, claim rights. This would be key by this report. Another comment is that I would say that such reports be shared with academia and business associations, especially the findings on entrepreneurship. So that I think that will be good to bring out the correlation very well. And then it will help, I'm sure, in developing strong business pitches. And then another one is these are great indicators of what is broken and needs fixing. Wondering how much difference payment for maternity leave, for instance, would make to gender equality with regards to women's economic empowerment in economies within this is sub-Saharan Africa, given the high level of informality in employment. There are metrics which would more aptly reflect our African reality. I think this is a great question that we have to answer here now. And of course, the key messages on the high cost of not putting into practice these laws, I think has to be discussed. So kindly respond, Emilia and Isabel, on this issue of, yes, we have seen these statistics, the data. How can it be more realistic within the sub-Saharan African context? Maybe a comment on that before we move to the breakout rooms where further discussions will be held.
Yeah, of course, it's a very important point. Our data looks at the formal sector specifically, and our assumptions are looking at an employed woman in a formalized job. So we are not looking at the full picture because the full picture, of course, includes the informal sector. That said, these laws are the basis of gender equality in any country, and they are a starting point. Our data makes it possible to compare the situation across countries, and taking into consideration the informal sector has complexities that can only be looked at in the context at the national level, with the context in the country specifically. This is why we use those assumptions to make our data comparable across countries. This doesn't mean that our data doesn't reflect the reality. It does reflect a portion of what is happening on the ground. And we do know that that's a limitation of our report, but it can be the starting point of a conversation.
Okay, Thank you. Go on, go on.
One more thing I wanted to add is that while it is true that most of our laws, or some of our laws, specifically apply to the formal sector, there's many of them which actually apply to all women. For example, we look at family laws and we also look at legislation on violence against women. So those would apply to all women regardless of their employment status. For example, we look at legislation on assets, inheritance, management of marital property. We look at marriage laws, and there's also some laws under entrepreneurship which would also apply to women that are not necessarily employed in the formal sector. So this just to add to what Emilia was mentioning.
Thank you so much for that. I think we are still in time. We now, I'm requesting that we get into the breakout rooms that I'm going to share just now. One of it being, as we said earlier, key ingredients to women's legal rights in Kenya, whereby Emiliano, Catherine, Frederick, and Isabel will still lead the conversation for about 30 minutes. Then there will be 15 minutes for you to interact closely. And it's all about reflecting on the persistent legal gaps that impact women in Kenya and discuss the role that individuals, you yourselves within institutions, and of course, members of the Women's Economic Empowerment Community of Practice can definitely have or get some insights on how to build more and further evidence for future legislative reforms in the country. And the second one will be towards available, affordable, and quality childcare services, which of course Alina will lead, looking at how COVID has actually demonstrated the importance of aligning childcare policies more closely with the needs of working parents, and of course in particular working mothers. So I am going to launch the rooms right now. Kindly belong to any, and we have 45 minutes in those rooms. Thereafter, you shall come back and then share what you've deliberated upon as we close. So the rooms are open. Kindly choose any. And if you are not able to, let me know. On your screen down there, there's a place for joining breakout rooms. And if it has not prompted you already, thank you for those that are already joining. I can see thank you for those that are already joining.